Hello, everybody. It is my great honor to welcome you all to the opening of SDG Week 2021. You can look forward to 3 days of discussion and debate around the role of business in helping to achieve the UN Sustainability Development Goals. This SDG Week is organized by the Hoffman Global Institute for Business and Society, and is co-designed with 6 student clubs and supported by Accenture Strategy. We have a packed program of conversations lined up ranging from impact investment to the benefits of gender diversity in business. This 3rd edition of the SDG Week is obviously taking place at a crucial moment for the planet as world leaders gather at Glasgow for COP26 to discuss humanity's response to the climate crisis. As the business school for the world, we have a strong responsibility and obligation to contribute towards this crucial debate. Indeed, the SDG Week sessions will feature speakers such as Paul Polman, the co-founder of Imagine. Paul will be calling actually from COP26 to talk about his new book, Net Positive, or how courageous companies thrive by giving more than they take. INSEAD will also be at COP26. Our very own Catel Legourvan, Executive Director of the Hoffman Institute, will be acting as a representative for the new Business Schools for Climate Leadership Initiative. It's a joint project, a collaboration between INSEAD and 7 other leading business schools. Catel will be there to help launch the initiative's new toolkit, which offers executives a practical guide to addressing the challenges and opportunities presented by the climate crisis. INSEAD has contributed a chapter on the relationship between climate change and inequalities, a clear reminder that environmental and social issues are deeply intertwined. Demonstrating the interdependence of these issues is one of the key aspects of the 17 SDGs. And it is essential that we understand these connections if we want to build back a better society. For us, this SDG Week is just one example how INSEAD looks to educate, engage, and inspire students, staff, faculty, our alumni community, and private and public sector organizations, and help them to make informed decisions around the challenges and the opportunities presented by the SDGs. All of the sessions promise to be enlightening and engaging. I'm particularly looking forward to the session with the Singapore-based conservationist scientist, Professor Ko Lian Ping, where he will be discussing the promises and pitfalls of the nature-based solutions and their potential contribution to tackling climate change. I'm also very excited to see that our Master in Management students will be involved in this year's SDG Week for the first time. In fact, their Funds for Good initiative has helped to co-organize a session on the future of Afghan women's education. Indeed, on the crucial issue of gender equality, SDG 5, I'm particularly proud to see that we have over 70% female participation with our speakers this week. INSEAD recently made clear commitments regarding gender balance within the school, when we became a champion of the United Nations He-for-She Alliance. I know that we still have a long way to go, but it is good to see that the momentum continues. For those who are in Europe, there is an opportunity to hear Professor Rebecca Henderson in person. She'll be talking to INSEAD's Mark Stabile about her book, Reimagining Capitalism, and how business can help catalyze the systemic change we need right now. If you're actually on campus in Fontainebleau, I would also invite you to pay a visit to a unique exhibition of First People's art. Entitled The Sahara and Human Adaptability to Climate Changes, it examines how humans have managed to adapt to previous climatic upheavals, such as the desertification of the Sahara. The exhibition, and indeed all these sessions at SDG Week, are free and open to all. I therefore urge members of the INSEAD community to get involved in these important conversations and find out how we can all make sure that business is acting as a force for good. Together, we can help bring the world closer to achieving global SDG goals. And now it is my great pleasure to hand over to Professor Claudia Zeisberger for our first session, which covers a very hot topic right now, namely the importance of properly managing and measuring impact in investing. Thank you, Claudia. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Julian. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel on measuring and managing all the money that is flowing into impact investment initiatives. A special thank you to our organizers, especially to our INSEAD Student Impact Fund for putting this fantastic panel together. So our student clubs were extraordinarily helpful, so very much appreciated. Without much further ado, let me start off by inviting our first panelist. The Environmental Protection Agency today will propose a new regulation targeting methane emissions. What's next? Methane emissions will soon be tracked down to individual sources via satellites, aircraft, and ground-based instruments. And so a voluntary initiative like the Global Methane Pledge may eventually transform into a regulatory regime. Commendable, but as we all know, time is running out and clearly not on our side. Now, helping us set the scene for a discussion around measurement and management of investments in the impact space is Mike McCreeless, Executive Director at Impact Frontiers and Head of Collaboration at the Impact Management Project. Mike, may I hand over to you to kick us off?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Claudia, and thank you to the team at INSEAD and Dean Mihov and to all of you for joining. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I've been asked to briefly provide an introduction to impact investing, although I'm sure that many of you already know something about it before we dive into some of the specific measurement challenges. So just to quickly share the definition from the Global Impact Investing Network, which is the most common definition given of impact investing as being investments that are made with the intention to generate positive, measurable social and environmental impact alongside a financial return. And there, I would just say, of course, we all know that all companies have impacts, both positive and negative. We know that all investments have impacts, both positive and negative. And this is just highlighting the intention for positive impact, the measurability of the impact, and the combination of impact with financial return. The definition of impact investing and the term impact investing is maybe 12 years old, but I think it is important to recognize that the concept is much older. You could certainly look back to the 1940s and 50s after the Bretton Woods agreements to the activities of development financial institutions and regional development banks who made investments in post-war recovery. You could even look further back to the first mutual cooperative societies in the south of the United States that were the first to offer life insurance to Black communities on a nonprofit basis. So there's a long history of financial institutions being organized and investing for the social good, but this is a new term that's been developed that fits the moment that we're in right now. A common question is, how is impact investing different than ESG investing, or how is an impact strategy different than an ESG strategy? And here I would say there's no one answer, and I would invite Claudia and our co-panelists to please weigh in and share their views. The shorthand that I often think of is ESG strategies tend to look within the boundaries of what happens inside the company. So things like policies, practices, procedures of the company. And they look at those subset of the internal policies, practices, and procedures that are likely to have financial impacts on the company's future performance. Whereas in shorthand, One definition of impact investing would be that it looks not just at what's going on inside the company, but also at the experiences of the people and the planet that the company impacts. So consumers, employees, supply chain partners, and so forth. And it doesn't necessarily look only at those issues that are financially material for the company, but also those issues that are material to the people experiencing them. So I would not put that forward as being the globally accepted definition or the normative one, but it's just one way to think about it. Now, as impact investing has gained traction, it's gotten more attention from progressively larger financial institutions and increasingly also celebrities. So this is, I'm sure you know Bono, lead singer of U2, who several years ago became involved in an impact investing fund organized by TPG, the Rise Fund. And this is a picture of Bono talking about his involvement in impact investing at the Skull World Forum. And he made a big fuss because he said that impact investing hitherto, prior to his involvement and prior to TPG arriving, had been an excuse for good people to do bad deals. And this is very controversial because, of course, the implication was, well, now TPG is here, the big private equity funds are here, Bono is here, they're going to show us how it's done properly because they bring the financial acumen, right? So I have to say Bono has gotten plenty of heat for this. I don't want to pile on. I actually quite like Bono, and I love U2, so I don't want to pile on to Bono. But it's an example of how this new paradigm is upending people's conceptions of what investing is and leading to interrogation of what is the role of the private sector, what is the role of the financial sector, and what is the role of policy and civil society. And in talking with different stakeholders about impact investing, this is just one of the perspectives that I hear. I often hear people say, okay, maybe it's bad deals done by good people. Maybe, these are do-gooders who want to do something positive in the world, but they don't have the financial acumen, and so they're making mistakes along the way, and this is causing them to be unprofitable. On the other side, you hear a big concern about impact washing. Is this just something that financial institutions and companies can do to, burnish up their reputations at low cost, put out some press releases, relabel some of their funds from ESG to impact, and avoid some of the deeper changes that may be necessary? Is it a fad? Another concern is it crowding out philanthropy, because why would you contribute to a social or environmental cause if you could achieve the same impact while receiving a financial return? Recently, I've heard a lot of concern about, is this distracting us from policy solutions? Have we been lulled into the sense that all we need to do to address climate change is to move our accounts from our standard, index fund into an ESG screened fund or a green mutual fund? And this is distracting us from the real difficult policy changes of the sort that are being discussed even this day at COP26. Is it old wine in a new bottle? Is it all of the above? The bigger question here is, I would never presume to try to answer any of these questions, but I would ask, how would you know? How would you make the case that impact investing is any of these things in the absence of the data on impact and also the data on financial performance that would be necessary to make these judgments? And so that's one of the challenges that the sector has been facing. At this point, I can share a little bit of my personal experience wrestling with this impact measurement and management challenge from my years at Root Capital, which is a nonprofit social investment fund that lends money to agricultural cooperatives and businesses across Africa, South America, and Indonesia, where after I received my MBA more years ago than I like to think about, I became, thank you for letting me know. I'm going to sit closer to the screen. Please let me know if you can't hear me. I joined the fund with the goal of figuring out, do the loans that this fund makes actually have an impact? And if so, which have the most impact? And this is a question that many financial institutions and funds are asking themselves. And I like to think of us as climbing this first mountain in the foreground, this mountain of impact management. And people get a certain altitude up and then they slip back down and then they try a different path. But many funds working on getting better at impact management. At Root Capital, we got to a certain altitude on this mountain of impact management, and we're increasingly able to validate that, yes, on average, our loans do cause positive changes for smallholder farmers in the environment. And in fact, there are some that cause more than others. And we felt good about ourselves for maybe a second before we realized that there were these other mountains behind the first one that nobody told us about, which is that everything we had done in impact management, we had built in a silo. And it was very difficult to use as a basis for decision making because we had no way to gauge what would be the financial implications of making decisions based on our new insights about impact. And so then we set out to scale the second and the third mountain with to pull everything we'd done on impact management out of its silo. We had a separate team who literally sat in a separate part of the office, who had their own data sets and their own vocabulary dedicated to impact, that it was very hard to marry together with what the investment team was doing on their side of the office and their data sets and their vocabulary and their decision-making processes. And we realized that if we didn't bring these two things together to form an integrated view on which loans offered the best financial performance as well as impact performance, that we would not be able to achieve our goal. And so we set out to bring them together with the goal of getting to this third mountain in the far distance of constructing and managing our portfolio towards an integrated frontier of impact, risk and return, and financial risk and return. And that was that's one of the main things that I would love to leave you with, is this idea that even with all the investment and attention being paid to impact data collection, impact evaluation, that data is only useful if you can really marry it together with the financial risk and return data to inform integrated decision making. Let's see. I'll just briefly share a couple of trends that I've seen recently. So we have fortunately learned a little bit about how to do impact management well in the last 10 years. And I would say that the recent trend among self-declared impact investors is interoperability. There's often a desire for investors that are new to the concept to say, okay, well, I want to do the right thing. Let me know what spreadsheet I should fill out or what form I should fill out or what metrics I should use, and then I'll just do that. And they want it to be given one product that they can just sort of implement. And unfortunately, we're not at that place. I don't know if we will ever get to that place, but we have figured out that there are a few different types of things that when you use them together can form a complete solution. So here I would highlight some guide to the processes of impact management that are useful for investors to implement. And here I would call attention to the operating principles of impact management that were facilitated by the International Finance Corporation. That can give you a sense of what are the things you should be doing along the way to measure and manage your impact. I'd point at metric sets, such as the IRIS catalog put out by the Global Impact Investing Network, or also corporate disclosures like those from SASB or Value Reporting Foundation, GRI. That can give you the very granular level of what to report. And then I can't help but share what my organization, now the Impact Management Project, has put out of the 5 dimensions of impact, what is happening, to whom is it happening, how much is happening, would it have happened otherwise, and then what are the risks of negative impacts occurring and positive impacts not occurring. That can give you a checklist of the issues that you should make sure that you're covering through whatever detailed impact metrics you select from whatever metric set you choose.
Mike, maybe on the metric side, I mean, do you see, as you just listed quite a few of them, do you see convergence? Do you see that in the next 12 to 18 months, we will see convergence on the different metrics, or will there always be a different set of measures for different organizations at different stage of the development?
It's a great question, and I do see, I see limited convergence. I see a greater degree of alignment, even if not convergence. But I do think that there's a natural limit on how much convergence can happen for two reasons. One of them is that convergence of metrics is limited by convergence of investors' goals.
Sure.
And by convergence of investors' contexts. And so long as different human beings have different goals in life and are operating in different contexts where those goals manifest in different ways, there's going to be some need to customize the metrics. Nevertheless, I do think that there's a great argument for harmonizing metrics where upstream asset owners need comparability in order to allocate capital. And so my preference is, rather than trying to organize bottom-up solutions where we all agree exactly what definitions to use, we let the harmonization conversation be led by those capital allocators who need the information in order to make a decision.
Sure. So Mike, thank you very much. This was a great kickoff to get us started. So allow me to invite our two fellow panelists. Let me start off with Sunita Grojek, who is the lead at Unicef Ventures, a venture fund that looks at seed funding in both fiat and cryptocurrencies. She is also an alumna from INSEAD, so always nice to have an alumna back. Thank you. And then we are being joined by Unmesh Sheth, who is founder and CEO of Sopact. Unmesh has many years and a solid track record in technology companies and innovation. And Sopact has been designed as an innovative and transformative solution for scaling social sector business and investments. And allow me to start off with a question to Unmesh. And let's just follow on with where Mike just led us off, and a topic that usually gets people reasonably excited. What's your perspective on the distinction between ESG and impact investing? I have to say, I find it at times being used interchangeably, the two terms. Do you agree that this is, do you agree with Mike, or how would you draw the boundaries?
Thank you, Claudia, for inviting. Fundamentally, there is a large number of capital, obviously, in the ESG side, more than 100 trillion altogether, basically focused on the corporate, on social good and environmental and governance aspect of it. Impact investment on the side is a rather smaller chunk, about 1 trillion and growing fast, essentially. All in all, the main difference, and I agree with the definition that Mike gave. One thing I would mention, that there's a subtle differences, obviously, on when we talk about impact investing, because if the definition of impact investing is really about using capital for social and environmental good, essentially. And that is the key word. We do see transition, the similar type of mindset coming into the ESG. A lot of the corporates are also moving towards outcome and stakeholder-based approach as well, but that's still in early stage. So let me clarify what impact investment is all about. Since it is about the capital for doing social good, it's all about outcome that you are creating into the community. And outcome is always focused on the people and planet that you are focusing on all together. So it is very important that the impact investing is very intentional about creating a change into the community or society or on the planet altogether. So I think that there is a large amount of capital waiting to shift from ESG side to the impact investing side. But the key to the success is that the impact data must be verified. And as the investment, the progress is made, and there are many gaps today as we speak, standards and frameworks are not sufficient, quite frankly. There needs to be further alignment between the impact investor and impact entrepreneurs, and common understanding of the outcome approach altogether. So there's a lot more work to be done, but I believe by focusing on the stakeholders, I think we could make a lot of progress in the impact investing side.
So where do you see the trend moving when you listen to your stakeholders? So, or where are maybe the pain points that you hear that they are struggling with?
So there is a common policy that standards and framework are going to cure everything. And in my opinion, it's just a start point, essentially. Ultimately, the biggest pain point is really impact investors to align with the impact entrepreneurs and a common understanding of what the outcome is. We believe the metrics thinking is a little bit more of a friction to the long-term growth, because fundamentally, if you want to improve the outcome, it is very important that impact investors gets aligned with the impact entrepreneurs. In order to do that, it is extremely important that the impact ratings and impact benchmark is not sufficient. What is important is to this dialogue between them on improving the capacity and understanding of what the outcome is. And secondly, on the impact entrepreneur side, they need to have a common understanding that the impact measurement is not like a measurement at all. It's more about improving their business model. It's about product market fit. And if they can do the continuous learning and improvement based approach, they can make a tremendous scaling altogether. But that requires that they have continuous process of listening to the stakeholders and improving their product market fit altogether.
So, and you are targeting under SOPAC to innovate in this space. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how you are looking to streamline the process and maybe what the challenges are in developing such a tool or a product to measure impact?
I'm glad you asked that. Fundamentally, we believe that there is a right way of doing it and a wrong way of doing it. So old way of doing it is to very expensive, time-consuming evaluation-based approach. And that approach hasn't worked at all in the market altogether. So we need more nimble approach. We use the word impact experiment, essentially. It's a basically short, fast, and nimble approach to listen to the stakeholders in a way that can give you continuous improvement of the process altogether. So from technology perspective, it can play a tremendous role in shortening this particular cycle of listening and giving you the outcome that aligns with the impact management project, communicate the impact based on 5 dimensions that Mike talked about, essentially. But that is where we see the huge benefit. However, in order to do that, there's a technology needs to catch up, and this is where a company like SOPAC is making a lot of progress, where there's a need to be a data pipeline, where you, from collecting data to data aggregation to intelligent analysis, both qualitative and quantitative, needs to become very automated, essentially. And as that becomes automated, impact entrepreneurs can really gain faster insights into the outcome they are really creating altogether.
Yeah, so you will find open doors on the INSEAD side when you start providing pipelines with data. As academics, we're on the hunt for that, especially in a new space like impact and ESG. So let me jump to Sunita before coming back. Sunita, thank you for joining the panel. Now, while most investors in the space are coming from the kind of private capital side, Unicef is a completely impact-driven organization, has always been like that, and has chosen to launch an impact investing venture. So can you tell us a bit more about your approach? How is it potentially different from our traditional venture funds? And give us a little bit more context.
Sure. Thanks so much, Claudia, and thanks for inviting us to speak here today. It's a pleasure to be back at INSEAD, even if virtually. So yes, we launched about 6-7 years ago our venture fund out of the innovation team here at Unicef, and really with a very specific purpose. And this is coming back, I think, to some of the points that Mike raised around what is the purpose and the objective of impact investing. I think, just to kind of recall a little bit the context that I operate in, we are a $7 billion organization that works around the world with the main kind of mission to improve the lives of children. And our venture fund by no means was ever meant to replace any of the core work that the organization does. It was designed to complement and fill gaps that we had identified. And those gaps were primarily around helping UNICEF be able to identify the newest, the most cutting edge technology solutions, and even more so in the frontier technology space that could ultimately show promising results and accelerate results for children. And so really, this fund is designed to be, if you want to say, sort of in the upper right-hand quadrant of newness of technology and uncertainty, which for an organization like UNICEF is quite an uncomfortable space to be in, right? We're generally quite a risk-averse place. We are largely publicly or donor funded, and so that means that we have a high level of accountability to do what we have promised to do with the funding that we receive. And so the fund is really meant to be complementary to these core programs that we have, and has brought on board donors or contributors, partners to UNICEF that understand the value of taking risk, of investing or providing funding to startups, and what value startups can bring to this exploratory nature around innovation. And I'm making these points because, again, I think it's really important to understand for us that this space of impact investing does not replace some of the other modalities that we have to achieve social results and social impact, in our case specifically focused on children. And so this was really designed with a very particular objective. And so what differentiates us, I think, in terms of maybe, Claudia, what you spoke about in terms of socially driven organizations, as well as more on the strict investment side, is that we aim to redefine, in some ways, value return. We look particularly at solutions that are open source. I can speak a little bit later more about that if that's of interest. And we're looking at sort of redefining and demonstrating how investment could be done differently. So one of the main criteria we have is to say, well, we're not a huge fund in the grand scheme of things. We're at about $40 million. How can we use that limited capital to demonstrate what results could be, and maybe where other private capital could flow? So we see ourselves really as, let's say, a provoker of new ideas, of a provoker of doing things in different ways. And some of those fundamental principles are around designing and making technology accessible in completely different ways, so that we decentralize the power over technology solutions. And we use open source principles as one of those. The second really underlying or underpinning approach is around diversity. We're about trying to channel capital into places, unusual places, unusual people, unusual solutions. We're not trying to be in the same space as those with significantly more capital that are operating maybe under other constraints and other principles. And then the last piece is really about how, and we spoke about that a little bit as well. And Umesh spoke a bit about different ways of assessing and monitoring results. Some of the things that we've put in place are, for instance, ways to monitor progress in real time. How can we use some really simple tools, and especially since we're investing in technology solutions, how can we have almost a real-time tracker or ticker that kind of just shows us, are the companies making progress on a regular basis against some of the goals that we set for ourselves and with them? And then how can we improve transparency around how funds operate? And that's really where, for instance, our engagement with cryptocurrency has come into play, to say we need to push the envelope. We need to be able to show how 100% transparency can add value, both to the enterprises that are receiving that funding, but also to those that might be interested in providing capital to these new kinds of investment vehicles.
Sure. And as it is a venture fund, so I need to ask a question closer to home to what I do. And within the context of UNICEF, do you take equity in your startups?
We do not take equity in the traditional sense. We actually define our stake as the open source intellectual property that the company generates. So we value that. We basically work with the ventures that we provide funding for during the investment period to place their particular solution on open source licenses. Just for those who may be less familiar with that concept, it basically means that the license itself, so that the software itself is accessible. So to use the famous analogy of the cake, you don't just get the cake, you get the recipe of the cake. And so what that means is that basically anybody could duplicate the cake, could make it in a different flavor, could make more of it, and potentially even change it if they have a different need for the base recipe. And so that is, we really look at that being the return that we look at. We putting that out into the public domain. while at the same time working very closely with our ventures to ensure that they don't give up and don't compromise on their financial sustainability and ability to generate a profit. And so we're tracking those alongside, of course, impact and results metrics. We track very closely where our portfolio stands in terms of their ability to generate revenue, their revenue growth, their growth into new markets, as well as we've had quite a few more recently kind of successful exits from the portfolio. And so those are metrics that we give equal importance to, again, because of sort of the very niche role that our fund is aiming to play in the overall space of funding for children.
Right. And since you're focusing on investing, or your mandate is particularly on open source platforms, is that because you think that this is an approach that should be applied to other SDGs as well?
So we operate largely across SDGs as an organization, but we have been very pleased to see that this approach and this focus on open source has been picked up across the SDGs, most recently by the UN Secretary General himself. He issued a roadmap last year, the Roadmap for Digital Cooperation, where he calls on all stakeholders to make digital solutions that could have an impact on the SDGs available as digital public goods. And he defines that specifically as open source software models, data, content, and standards, I believe. And so we are seeing that this focus on open source and the value that open source can bring in terms of scaling, in terms of ownership by local entities and business models is being picked up globally, and has been basically we're all being held to account at the UN level, and stakeholders that are active in achieving the SDGs to try and meet the standard of digital public good.
Sure. So maybe to all three of you. So thank you very much for everyone putting this into context. Why don't we, knowing that we have quite a few aspiring impact entrepreneurs in the audience, what can impact entrepreneurs do to attract impact investors? How can they make it easier so the investors find the right targets? Mike, do you want to kick off with that? Do you want to give us some thoughts, and then maybe everyone else can just jump in?
Well, absolutely. Just briefly, I'm curious to hear my colleagues' thoughts, but I would simply say to be clear with themselves and clear with their prospective investors about their goals, to profile those goals with regards to the 5 dimensions that I mentioned, and to agree on how they'll be measured. And I think to recognize that there is room in the market for a wide variety of goals, including businesses that are basically, just normal businesses as we normally think of them, but hoping to do good along the way, to businesses that are really setting out to achieve a new type of social impact that has never occurred before. And there's no need to dress one business up to look like another, but rather to just be clear with yourself and your partners about your goals.
So, I mean, impact funds or impact investors have mandates as well, and as it would be in venture and in private capital in general, you need to find the one that matches your particular target and your entrepreneurial effort the best you can, right? Absolutely. Unmesh, do you want to add to that?
Absolutely. So if you look at impact entrepreneurs life cycle perspective, first of all, they need to realize that if they want to differentiate themselves from other competing capital, essentially, it is important to make sure that you focus on defining your impact evidence of your programs, whether it's you're working on a solar lantern or agriculture product, whatever that may be. And that can be obviously done through the impact experiment that I talked about. Fundamentally, the idea is to collect the effective data that demonstrates the evidence. And the way you can demonstrate the evidence, obviously, by collecting very effective questions aligned with 5 dimensions of impact that Mike talked about, and communicating those differentials essentially to the investments altogether. Now, there is a common misconception that this is the process of third-party evaluator. And I would highly recommend not to rely on that aspect. Instead, as an entrepreneur, start to own up that particular process. This process of impact measurement should be integral part of your business model altogether. If you want to long-term succeed with raising capital, it is extremely important that you have those impact data and dashboards available to your dashboards so that you can go to competing capital and really raise money from multiple sources altogether. But in your process needs to be integral part of it. And the fact of the matter is, if you do it right and smart way, it doesn't take that long time altogether. So you just have to do it in a way that is very effective and align with the 5 dimensions and really communicate the where you are and where you are going. And that's the good differential that you can use to raise your capital.
Right, thank you. So we have actually quite a few questions coming in, but Sunita, I'd like to hear from you as well. What can we do to, as impact entrepreneurs, to get your attention?
I think maybe just it's a bit like asking, how do you find your spouse or partner? It's all about the match and being very clear about what your objectives are and whether they are a good match for the fund or the investor that you're speaking with. And I think there's I have found the most productive and the most successful conversations with entrepreneurs that are very upfront about what their objectives are, and we're able to very early on identify whether there's a match, and then there's no hard feelings if they're not. I think we just both need to, on both sides, there needs to be a strong recognition of where the added value is of that relationship. The only other thing I would add to that is social impact is messy. It's messy and it's difficult. It's complicated, and it's complicated to measure. And I think the most powerful stories I have heard from entrepreneurs is when they're very clear about what their additionality or their value add is of the solution or the product or the program or the approach that they're pitching, and recognizing where they fit into the overall ecosystem. Entrepreneurs and impact investors are not going to solve on their own, and are not going to on their own drive the kind of social impact and the social change we need to see, but they have a very specific role to play within that ecosystem. And the clearer you are about not being the silver bullet, but recognizing where you might fit within the whole program that can generate the big picture result, I think the more attraction and clarity the pitch will actually have.
Yeah, thank you for that. So let me maybe just go back to the management and the measurement challenge as well, and maybe to Unmesh and Mike. So what we've seen, I would argue, in the last 5 to 6 years, we have seen the space grow, has grown more sophisticated, but what we've also seen is a challenge when it comes to oversight. So in the ESG world right now, IOSCO is working with IFRS to write global standards to just simply deal with the disclosure on climate change. So what would this look like for impact investing? So what can we, maybe I'm asking you to look a little bit in your crystal ball and say, what will the future look like when it comes to standards, if I dare to say that word right now? Unmesh, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, so the crystal ball is difficult right now at the moment, partly because there's a lot of alignment that still needs to occur between the impact investors and impact entrepreneurs altogether in terms of what to measure and what is the outcome is essentially. But I would say there's a lot of things happening both from impact investor side. They want to have high quality deals on their side. On the other hand, impact entrepreneurs wants to also get high quality investment as well. Technology like blockchain can eventually bridge the gap where as long as they have a very high quality value creation by the impact, ultimately investors can find those things and reward that kind of deals faster altogether. I believe we are a little bit farther away on those kind of things, but ultimately, in my opinion, there needs to be progress on both sides. Entrepreneurs needs to become more sophisticated about what the impact is essentially on their side, so they can really raise smarter capital or effective capital altogether. On the other hand, I believe there's a lot of work needs to be done from impact investor side as well to really understand that if they want to scale this ecosystem, it's not sufficient that you benchmark away. It's more important that you support your entrepreneurs and helping them to scale their impact altogether. And that means getting their hands dirty and really work with them hand on hand to scale the process altogether.
Which is the original definition of venture capital, right? If we go back to Georges Doriot, one of the founders at INSEAD. So to really basically work closely with the entrepreneur to continuously encourage, support, and as Mike mentioned early on, we may not have the perfect solutions yet, but we have to start going down that road and slowly developing them. So Mike, do you want to add something to that, to the conversation about potential directionally about standards?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with everything that Mush said. And I would just, I do believe that disclosure and more broadly, assurance and verification are part of the end game that's necessary for all of this to work and to scale up. In the narrow market of impact investing, the disclosure has really focused mostly on disclosure of what practices the investor, him or herself, is using. But not on disclosure of actual performance, with a very reasonable assumption that good practices will lead to good performance. But I think eventually performance disclosure is necessary too. In the global markets, it's funny, impact investors would like to think that they're so far ahead, but actually the ESG market is arriving at the mandatory disclosure earlier. But there it's again focused on the practices of companies, and to some extent the outputs, but not outcomes. But nevertheless, a huge step forward in the global markets compared to what I would have thought possible 10 years ago.
So yes, absolutely. Now a question to all of you. I mean, what role, if any, have regulators to play in this space? Or shall we, the argument is that we would like the regulators to stay out of it, and the free market forces will ultimately shape where we end up on the impact investment space? Leave it up.
I would wait for Mike to answer that question. I'm suspicious that regulators can play any particular role in impact investing in a short run altogether, partly because there are a lot of pieces of puzzle needs to be connected first before the regulator can come and really mandate that kind of process altogether. I would love to see that one day, but I don't think we are there yet with respect to impact investing, because there's just a lot of big divide between the impact investing and the impact entrepreneurs. And unless there is a common definition of the outcome is and what really, how they're really improving their performance, it's rather a little bit too premature to start talking about the regulators. But I think Michael is a little bit more closer to answering that question than I am.
Okay, Mike, if you dare.
Not necessarily. I would just say, I share the concern, but at the same time, I do think that regulators can play one role of applying pressure for voluntary standards to sort themselves out more quickly, to make more rapid progress, lest the much feared regulator decide to insert themselves. And I do think that in the long term around disclosure of performance, there will need to be some level of regulated mandatory disclosure.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I would say is that if just mandating on impact reporting actually does not solve any problem whatsoever. And what is needed essentially is that every effective evidence is collected needs to be actionable altogether. So there's a little bit of a change in thought process that impact reporting is just one out of many different check marks. More important thing is impact manager, impact entrepreneurs is acting upon the data they are gathering and improving the process altogether, because this is not like a one single bullet that's going to solve that problem. They have to continuously be working on it to improve the process. If they don't really take that as a seriously, it's difficult to scale their business.
Okay. So Sunita, you want to have a final comment on that? Regulation, or rather not?
You know, I'm less active in that space. I think one of the main concerns or things that are on my mind are maybe less on the direct impact measurement and disclosure, but again, coming back a little bit more to this idea of what's the role that impact investing plays and how can it skew the market or skew the focus on certain kinds of models or results. And I think, you know, this is where the recognition, maybe not of regulation, but of even within countries, kind of this recognition of that has to be a patchwork of different instruments, of different funding models, of different business models that's ultimately going to achieve those results. Because to give an extreme example, but if we focus exclusively on solutions or on models that can generate a financial return alongside a social one, I think we're going to get very quickly into equity issues and access issues and issues around the last mile, that if we again look at overall achievement of the SDGs are really the hard parts, right? And are the hard bits. And so that's really at least where I see the real risk lying in the long term in terms of how we need to regulate is too big of a word, but like guide and shape how the ecosystem patches together.
So we have a couple of really interesting questions. So maybe I'll just kick off with Sunita's last comment. So we have one question starting with the entrepreneur side, and the questions are across the board from all directions. So I'll try to kind of stay on top of it. So as a small town entrepreneur who wants to do some serious good in the world, make themselves visible to investors, how can they do that? Isn't kind of the access to capital the kind of hurdle that someone needs to overcome? And maybe isn't that the one of the largest problems that we have? So giving those entrepreneurs that want to do good access to capital. Unmesh, you commented earlier on.
Yeah, I can do. So basically, we do this thing regularly. So we have, similar to your fund, we have partnered with the Miller Center here in Silicon Valley. It's a Santa Clara University Jesuit school, and they're 20 years history working with the entrepreneurs. And one of the key things is that if you want to get a notice, essentially, it's important that you align with some of these accelerators like that, who can truly guide you through the process of what the impact management is, essentially. We have a goal, obviously, we already trained 20 entrepreneurs, and every year we're going to be training 75. And that essentially initial capacity is very important. And if you enroll into some of the program like this, you are on a fastest path to really helping your impact and really getting access to the impact capital faster altogether, because many of the impact investors are looking for that kind of dashboards to see how are you really scaling in various different dimensions altogether.
So thank you for that. We had another question, and that was basically, given that multiple stakeholders and rapid scaling when investing in growing businesses is vital, how can we ensure on a much higher level that impact is not double or triple counted? So how can you be sure your investment drives a specific outcome and not just the investment of someone else? So how do we potentially ensure that we allocate, that the contribution is correct?
I'm happy to jump in on this
Mike,
one.
go ahead.
I mean, I spent a lot of time early in my career trying to figure out what portion of the balance sheet we had financed, and then to adjust the number of smallholders, farmers proportionately. And in the end, I'm not sure it was a good use of time. I think the most important thing is to consider not how can the attribution of different impacts be split up amongst those who contributed to it, but to just think critically about, was my contribution necessary to cause the outcome, or in my absence, would this outcome have occurred otherwise? I would trade all of the attribution analysis in the world for better contribution or causality analysis, or what CDT called additionality analysis.
And you can do that by asking a pretty effective question to the stakeholder altogether. So essentially, stakeholder tell you what is your contribution is. And secondly, asking how many beneficiaries served is one of the worst metrics you can ever ask, essentially. And I see that a lot in a funder's perspective, that they ask this kind of very shallow metrics to aggregate and show that I served 20 million beneficiary. That has absolutely no meaning to it altogether. So I think investors need to stop asking those sort of questions and focus on their contribution or additionality rather than focusing on aggregating the results like that.
Sure. So Sunita, we have a question on what real-time tracker does Unicef Ventures use for its measurement? So how does this actually work? Can you give us some more color on that?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's important to make the distinction in terms of what in the pure social and development space is called monitoring versus evaluation, right? And monitoring is sort of what you do on an ongoing basis where you track progress against certain objective. Evaluation is more what you do towards the end, generally in a traditional approach, where you sort of say, well, it has achieved the objectives that were set at the beginning of the project. And the examples I was referring to fall much more in the first category than the second. But so some of the things that we did, for instance, and again, this is very much in the context of the type of companies and the type of solutions we support, was we invest in early stage companies that are at the prototype and piloting stage of technology, largely software solutions. And so that allows us to, for instance, develop APIs that pull data directly from companies' GitHub repositories where they might be uploading their open source code. And so we can see on a regular basis, are they making commits? How often is that software being forked? How much is the team interacting with it? And as some of our key kind of progress and tracking indicators during the course of the investment is around product development, it allowed us to see in real time to what extent there's progress on the product and to what extent that's being done in a truly kind of open source fashion, which is what we're looking at. The second area that we looked at and we developed very simple tools as around growth, user growth. And so again, as we're looking at software platforms, we're actually able to automate that data being tracked and being pulled for our internal dashboards. And so those are pieces that, again, less on the assessment of whether a result is being achieved and more on the sort of tracking of progress against what I guess has here been referred to more as outputs than outcomes.
Okay, thank you. Now, different tack. What are your thoughts on private equity funds joining impact investing? Is there space for it, or are we gonna? Where do you see their value in it, Mike? Go ahead.
Look, I mean, I'm enthusiastic about the dissemination of the thinking around measuring and managing your impact on stakeholders as broadly as possible. So in that sense, I think it's terrific and want to strongly encourage it. I know that there are always questions about greenwashing, and that will have to be worked out through measurement and disclosure. I mean, the question that I always have is, working with the people who are the individuals leading on the impact funds or sustainability funds, like I always find that those people are intelligent people of good intention, and they're trying to create change within their organizations. And so when dealing with those people, I think it's important to, how can we help them drive change more effectively within the operating environment that they're in? The question I always have is, well, what about the large organization? So if a private equity company has launched an impact fund, that's great. I'm perfectly happy to believe that that impact fund has a positive impact, which is well measured. I find that fairly uncontroversial, but I'm still wondering about, what about the other funds that it's launching, funds 1 through 9 that came before fund 10, and what are the impacts that those funds have had on stakeholders? So I always look at, can we engage not just with the impact carve out, but with everything else that the company is doing as well?
So, I mean, ultimately it goes back to clear mandate on the private equity side, and what you're questioning is whether an impact or hardcore impact fund can coexist with vehicles that do have a lesser or no impact motivation at all, and how do you measure it then on the fund level? Which is a good question, and quite a few of the LPs are asking the same question around it as well. Unmesh or Sunita, do you want to comment on that?
I'm not an expert on that one, so I'm going to pass. Sunita.
Okay. All right. Sunita, do you want to, I mean, do you see private equity as potentially an exit for some of your startups? Maybe not today, but further down the line?
Yeah, I think just given the stage that we operate in, it's not something for them in the near future or as an immediate follow-on to our funding, but absolutely something that we see in their future. And Unicef is currently exploring, the structuring of private equity in collaboration with private equity funds towards investment areas where we see that financial instrument could actually accelerate results. I think one of the really interesting questions here, and this is what Umesh has talked about, is this need for sort of getting your hands dirty and accompanying impact entrepreneurs, and how does that match with and align with some of the return expectations that we see from these financial instruments. I've been a part of very interesting conversations, and internally, part of my team, we've been looking at how we look at these sort of more blended finance instruments where we recognize that the need to finance this getting your hands dirty and providing that support to impact entrepreneurs may need to get funded from different sources and based on different metrics than the straight up investment that's provided to them. And how do you create an instrument that allows for both of that to happen and ultimately generate the highest level of returns? I think those are some of the really interesting models where we just recognize what some of the additional funding and support needs are to actually maximize the impact return that we're looking for.
Yeah. So I'm just looking over our question in the interest of time. Allow me to kind of pull a few of them together. There are quite a few around the balance between impact and the business focus. So on the entrepreneur side. So I think, Mike, you started to address this by talking about considering financial risk and return data and a more integrated approach. I think you focused on the conversation around risk management. So how should kind of investors perceive that kind of integrated value? So on the one side, the impact, on the other side, the business focus.
I mean, I'll share a little bit about how Impact Frontiers works with investors to address that, which is that we don't assume that there is necessarily always or never a trade-off between the two. Rather, we gather the data on impact and on financial performance. We put the data together, and then we see where the data leads. And then based on your goals and your context, you can decide what investments will best optimize across your impact and financial goals. We actually, I can't resist, but we created our first ever TikTok style 50-second video on this topic of doing integrated impact and financial. And I see Sunita's face. She's just like, what? But I'll with permission, I'll share that in the chat in case folks are interested.
Sure. Please put it in the channel. That'd be great. I'm sure we'll all be happy to have a look at it. Unmesh, do you wanna comment on that too? The balance between impact and business focus on the measurement side.
Yeah, so there's a common fallacy, and this is a huge point of friction in entrepreneurs. They consider social impact as a separate from the business goals altogether. And I would say they can be wrong about that, essentially. But fundamentally, if you want to, and I will give you a very specific example. So we are working with a small fishery, which is focusing on providing mobile application for fishermen in South Africa. And for them, in order to grow, essentially, it's evident that they need to focus on the sustainable fishing and the women empowerment as the key objective. But those objectives cannot be any different from their business objective. Why? Partly because in order to scale their business, they have to look through the data sources that they have in multiple places and see why I'm providing access to my fishermen to the marketplace and to the direct consumer, but somehow I'm not seeing the product adoption to it. You cannot say that this is issues of impact measurement. This is more about business where they need to see the data across the multiple data source and see what are the resistance, what are the friction they have in terms of adopting the product altogether. So in some sense, it really helps you to make sure that you are continuously learning from those data, which is really what's going to help you grow your business faster altogether. If you don't focus on the right outcome and don't focus on why stakeholders are not adapting the product, ultimately it really boils down the same thing. So in a way, it's a very integrated process altogether. So sooner we understand and really believe that this is really integrated, more likely to faster to grow your business altogether.
Sure. And maybe on a final note, very quickly from all of you, how do disruptive events like we just had in 2020, like COVID, affect the way we measure social impact? Was it positive or negative?
We have seen a huge positive, a net positive in terms of interest from, especially, actually, we thought it was impact investment, but actually from business side of it. Okay. A lot of the large businesses are coming to us and say, okay, I have many programs and I've been doing those things for years, but I don't know whether they're effective or not. Can you help us through that? I have 20 programs. I don't know which one is more effective than others altogether. Social impact is a data-driven approach. And essentially everybody from the business to impact investors to philanthropy is finally awoken and to see how do I really communicate the impact? How do I understand my impact better altogether? Okay. So time is now for you to start paying attention to it.
So, okay, positive. Mike, on your side?
I mean, I think that it didn't necessarily change for positive or negative, but what it does is it illustrates and shows into sharp relief the inequalities that already exist in our society and motivates more effort both to address those inequalities and in so doing to measure them.
Okay, thank you. Sunita?
Yeah, I think agree with all of what's been said. I think it shed light on the urgency, and it shed light on the inequalities of really basic infrastructure and basic access, and how some of us were able to cope quite well with the pandemic, while for others it just completely disrupted their lives. I think your question was specifically on the impact measurement piece, though, and whether that changed in any way. I think one of the pieces that we really saw great interest in is the ability to measure very quickly the impact of particular measures or policies that were put in place, because it was such a new space in general. It was sort of a completely unexplored territory, predicted by many, but yet we were woefully unprepared to respond to the global pandemic. We saw the need, for instance, for new tools that allow governments and others to understand whether social distancing measures were having an impact, and what their impact was on mobility, and who was that impacting more than others. And so that's definitely something that we as an organization, at least through our data science work, for instance, saw an uptake on, where being able to work very closely with businesses that had understood that core business asset that they have, which is data, could suddenly generate insights that would allow us to be able to respond better to the pandemic and more quickly, and then be able to assess whether that response was the right one, was definitely a trend that we saw. Again, something that wasn't new, and we had seen more localized in pandemics and emergency situations. It wasn't, obviously, around the world for many countries. It wasn't the first time that they were hit with a pandemic and experienced things like school closures. It was just the first time that it was a global experience. And so that was definitely something that we saw emerge.
So thank you very much. First, let me thank my wonderful panel. So Sunita, Mike, and Unmesh, thank you for making time for joining us. We have, unfortunately, lots of questions in the Q&A session that remain unanswered, so I apologize for that. So in the interest of time, let me quickly summarize. So I think controversial as ESG and impact pledges may be, one point I think is clear by now: we have to get everyone, private sector, public sector, and governments, not only around the table, but we need to start to act, and start to act now. So beyond agreeing on various targets, whether it's scope 3 or SDG, we must agree on how to measure them, audit them, and then we can potentially price them appropriately. It may be time that we get as obsessive about tracking our sustainability goals as we tend to be about tracking the financial goals that our businesses have. So on that note, I would like to thank everyone, thank my panel, and basically hand back to our team. Let me basically point out as well, we've had a fantastic audience. Thank you for your engagement. But this is just the start of the SDG week at INSEAD. We have plenty of interesting sessions coming up on climate and diversity, panel on discussion on sustainability for non-professionals, sustainability organizations hosted by our Endeavor and by Accenture. And so please do join us again in the next 3 days, the next 2 days, to listen to some of my colleagues and some of our student clubs manage some more. Thank you very much. If you would be so kind also to share your feedback with us, we have a Qualtrics survey basically that you can access. And if you'd like to share your experience in the panel, please be so kind and tag us in social media as well. On that note, thank you very much. Thank you to all my panelists. Thank you to Anusha and all the student clubs behind the scenes that helped me manage all the questions. It was a pleasure.